Welcome to another lecture. We just talked about the Synod of Orange, which means we're in the 6th century. And that means, by most historians' accounts, we are now moving into the Middle Ages, or more precisely, the early Middle Ages. Obviously, there are no clear lines here. Just as we didn't wake up one day and say, we've officially moved from modernity to postmodernity, so too no one looked around and said, we're now in the Middle Ages. Actually, a lot of people use Augustine as the transitional figure to the Middle Ages. Not always, but a lot of times in books on the history of Christian thought, Augustine appears in the Middle Ages volume rather than the early Christianity volumes. But the point is, from our perspective, the church is starting to enter a new era or epoch. For one, the emperors increasingly focus on the eastern side of the empire and leave the western half to fend for itself. As a result, the church in the West has a different set of problems and issues to deal with. But besides that, the Western church and the Eastern church are starting to separate in subtle or not so subtle ways. People in the East have different concerns than people in the West. For example, it's not an accident that the Council of Orange was held in Gaul. The Eastern church didn't wrestle with things like free will and predestination nearly as much as the Western church. And the Eastern church just plain wasn't interested or convinced by Augustine. Anyway, you might say that the Western church is starting to become Roman Catholic and the Eastern church is starting to become Eastern Orthodox, a distinction that comes to place formally with a symbolic break in 1054. For now, we will hang out in the West and address two major topics. The first is monasticism, and the second, papacy and politics. Technically speaking, monasticism emerged and even started to flourish before the Middle Ages. So we'll start our narrative of early monasticism in the 4th century and then move into the Middle Ages. When the church was being persecuted, the martyrs were the model Christians. They were willing to be tortured or murdered for Christ. When we read the excerpts of the martyrdom of Polycarp, you got a good sense of how much respect and appreciation was given for people who refused to cave under the pressure to make sacrifices to the gods. But as that era came to an end, thousands started pouring into the church, and it became increasingly important to figure out how one's commitment to the faith is best expressed. If you aren't required to give up your life literally, are there ways that you can give up your life figuratively for Christ? For a lot of people, the answer to that question was found in monasticism. In the year 324, a man named Aurelius Isidorus filed a complaint with his local government authorities in Egypt. Aurelius was a farmer, and one day he found a cow in one of his fields eating and trampling on the fruits of his labor. So he went after the cow and starts trying to chase it away off his land. And this provokes the owners of this cow, Pamonus and Harpalus, to start assaulting Aurelius. And according to Aurelius's written statement, quote, "If I had not obtained help from Antony, the deacon, and Isaac, a monk, they would probably have finished me off altogether." So what does that anecdote have to do with anything? Well, the story itself doesn't matter much. But historians are interested in this statement because it indicates that monk, or monaxis, was an established category or a fixture of the Egyptian countryside by the year 324. And what's more, the plaintiff here seems to think that invoking that title monk might actually help his cause. So generally speaking, we might ask ourselves, who was this Isaac, and what did it mean or imply when Aurelius identified him as a monk? Well, let's start with the word monk, the Greek word monaxis. Without thinking too hard, you can probably guess where the word comes from. Monos, as in one or singular. So a monk is a solitary person or one who is alone. So monks are said to follow the monastic life. In other words, monasticism or being a monk involves, at least to some degree, separation or isolation from the world. And by the 4th century, we have Christians who are characterizing themselves in this way, like Isaac. Generally speaking, when people talk about monasticism in the early church, they distinguish between two different types. The first is what's usually referred to as eremitic monasticism. The second is cenobitic monasticism. So I want to talk about both forms. Eremitic monasticism is usually traced to someone named Antony. Technically speaking, Antony wasn't the founder of monasticism, but he's certainly the person who made it well known, especially after biography was published by Athanasius. Antony's story goes like this. Antony was born sometime around the year 250 in Egypt to wealthy Christian parents. But around the time that he was 18 or 20, they both died and left him with a considerable amount of money and assets. They also left him to look after his younger sister. And here, I'd like you to pick up the story of Antony by the account of Athanasius in the work Life of Antony. So go ahead and pause the presentation, download the handout from Moodle, and then we'll have some comments about what you read. There are a lot of things we might comment on about this story of Antony. But first, you want to note that he's really struck by Jesus' story about the rich young man in Matthew 19. So he takes that story quite literally, and he gets rid of everything. He sells all of his stuff. But then he does something more radical yet. He moves out into the desert. In Egypt, you have this narrow, fertile ribbon of land along the Nile. But very quickly, you can move to the east or the west and be out in the desert. And that's where Antony goes. The word hermit, by the way, comes from the Greek word for desert. So for something like 20 years, he lives out in solitude. And all the while, he's trying to pursue a life of holiness or purity without being disturbed by the cares of the world. But it wasn't easy, because even though he's not disturbed by the world, he's constantly battling demons who are tempting him to sin. And the descriptions of these battles are really intense, and they inspire a lot of intense artwork, similar to what you see on the screen. In another portion of the life of Antony, Athanasius tells us that Satan rallies or embodies all of these wild beasts to attack him, and they're surrounded by him. But the main point I want you to think about is, who is the model Christian? It isn't a bishop being persecuted before the Roman crowd. The model Christian now, at least for a lot of people, is the solitary monk or hermit who, like Antony, is denying the world and defying the devil out in the desert. As I said, Antony isn't the founder of the Eremitic movement, but he contributes to its popularity. A lot of that is because of Athanasius' book. But there were also a lot of people who followed him around and wanted to learn from him. And by the time Athanasius writes this, he can claim, quote, "And thus it happened in the end that cells arose even in the mountains, and that the desert was colonized by monks, who came forth from their own people and enrolled themselves for the citizenship in the heavens." By the end of the 4th century, another account claimed that there was no town in Egypt which was not surrounded by hermitages as if by walls. Well, obviously such a claim is probably exaggerated by our standards of accuracy, but nevertheless, the monastic lifestyle was drawing a lot of people. So besides battling demons, what was the monastic lifestyle like? What did people do all day? For the most part, people would meditate on scripture and the Psalms, and perform some kind of manual labor. A lot of time was spent weaving mats or baskets while meditating and praying in their cell or cave or whatever kind of abode they had made. So it was a very ascetic lifestyle, including celibacy and a lot of fasting. And there is a lot of misunderstanding at this point. A lot of people look at these monks with their ascetic disciplines and assume that they're trying to punish or mortify their bodies. But that's not really what's going on. The ascetic practices and solitary life were seen as a means toward achieving a pure heart. Here's how one monk put it. The ultimate goal of our life is, as I said, the kingdom of God, or kingdom of heaven. The immediate aim is to purity of heart, for without purity of heart, none can enter into that kingdom. We should fix our gaze on this target and walk towards it in as straight a line as possible. If our thoughts wander away from it, even a little, we should bring back our gaze towards it and use it as a kind of test, which at once brings all our efforts back onto the one path. It is for this end, to keep our hearts continually pure, that we do and endure anything, that we spurn parents and home and position and wealth and comfort and every earthly pleasure. If we do not keep this mark continually before the eyes, all our travel will be futile waste that wins nothing and will stir up in us a chaos of ideas instead of single-mindedness. So for these desert monks, one's spiritual quest couldn't be separated from the physical body. Part of having a body meant having desires and passions and habits, and those were all things that had to be overcome to have purity of heart. Furthermore, a properly trained body could carry positive habits that would help sustain the soul. So the point of the ascetic life was not to punish the body or to try to gain favor with God. Rather, all those disciplines were very intentionally aimed at restoring human nature to what it should be. Anyway, that gives you a little bit of a sense of eremitic monasticism, the monasticism of those who sought to live a solitary life. But here's where I need to be careful about not overstating things or generalizing too much, because the level of solitude varied. So a lot of times you had almost colonies of monks all living in proximity together and even attending church together on Sundays. Remember Isaac, the cow guy? He was willing to help out when needed. So monks were willing to sell their baskets or to buy bread or oil. So keep that in mind. The level of isolation varied. There was another type of monasticism that comes to prominence in the 4th century, usually referred to as Cenobitic monasticism. Cenobitic means common life. And if you think about it, you can maybe parse out what 2 Greek words it comes from. If you're thinking koinos or koinonia and bios, life, you get common life. The person credited with developing or popularizing this kind of monasticism is someone named Pachomius. Pachomius was born around 285, which makes him a younger contemporary of Antony. Pachomius was not from a Christian family. However, when he was 20 or so, he had to serve in the imperial army. So he was a conscript, a person drafted. And as the story goes, he was being held in prison until he could serve and encountered some Christians who would bring him food and drink. This gesture really impressed him, and he promised that he would convert if he was released. And that is exactly what happened. After he left, he converts, gets baptized, and becomes an ascetic monk under the guidance of an older monk. And after a while, he has a vision while he is out gathering wood in an abandoned village. And in this vision, he is instructed to build a monastery there, an enclosed community where people can live ascetic lives together and be separated from the world. Here's one account of what happened. Tabanisi is a place in which there lived a certain Pachomius, one of those who have lived in the straight way, so that he was counted worthy both of prophecies and angelic visions. He was exceedingly devoted both to his fellow men and his brethren. Accordingly, to him as he sat in his cave, an angel appeared and said, "You have successfully ordered your own life, so it is superfluous to remain sitting in your cave. Up, go out and collect all the young monks and dwell with them, and according to the model which I now give you." So Pachomius starts this communal experiment, and pretty soon they need to build another one. And in just a couple of decades, there were 9 of these monasteries and 2 communities for women, all of which were operating as a confederation under the direction and guidance of Pachomius himself. So what were these monasteries like? Well, each monastery was surrounded by a wall, and within the wall there would be houses for the monks to live in. There might be 2 or 3 monks per room or cell, but there would also be a common room for meetings. By the time Pachomius died, these communities had 200 to 300 members, so things became quite developed, and soon there would be a church, a library, a kitchen, and various workshops. Here's one description of what a day looked like in the Cenobitic community. Some come in at the 6th hour and eat, others at the 7th, others at the 8th, others at the 9th, others at the 11th, and others in the late evening. Others every other day, so that each letter knows its own hour. So, alas, is it with their work. One works on the land as a laborer, another in the garden, another in the forge, another in the bakery, another in the carpenter's shop, another in the fuller's shop, another weaving the big baskets, another in the tannery, another in the shoemaker's shop, another in the scriptorium, another weaving the young reeds, and they learn all the scriptures by heart. So people are busy. They're busy doing work and praying and meditating. And one of the reasons all this works is that there's a very strict hierarchy in these communities. The monks are all ranked by superiority. Every house, which includes a group of monks, has a superior, and then the monastery as a whole has a superior. They also developed a set of rules or precepts to keep things running smoothly. These rules aren't actually very interesting. They deal with the practical things like distributing food at mealtime. They also have a lot of if statements, such as what if someone comes to visit, or what if someone gets sick, things like that. That gives us a little bit of a picture of Cenobitic monasticism, or monasticism in a more communal form. But the bigger point is that by the 4th century, when the status of Christianity is on the rise in the Roman Empire, a lot of Christians, especially in Egypt, start adapting some form of a monastic lifestyle. They start separating themselves from the world for the purpose of being pure. But the story doesn't end there, because monasticism turned out to be more than a fad. In fact, as Christianity progresses, monasticism becomes increasingly influential on and integrated with the rest of the church. Monks start to become theologians, bishops, and above all, popes. Much of that success has to do with someone named Benedict. Benedict was born sometime around 480 in the town of Nursia, which would be about 100 miles or so northeast of Rome. As a child, he went to Rome to study, but he was never all that impressed with Rome because of what appeared to him to be an excess of vice. And furthermore, he wasn't all that impressed with the education he was receiving, later describing it as, quote, furnished with unlearned wisdom. As a result, he moved outside the city and lived in a cave as a hermit for 3 years. He would have been a teenager at this point, 15 to 20 years of age. During this time period, he starts to pick up disciples, people who want to learn from him. As a result, he starts 12 different communities or proto-monasteries and serves as the abbot. But the local clergy didn't really appreciate his efforts, and so he relocated and founded a new monastery around the year 529. At this point, he's almost 50. Starting a monastery was not something new. People had already been doing this for a couple of centuries. But what was so important about this monastery was that it operated according to the rule, a set of regulations that became particularly influential for other monasteries. And one of the things that made the rule so effective was that it was comprehensive, it was moderate, and it was orderly. It was comprehensive because it gave really specific guidelines rather than just maxims or principles. It was moderate because it provided a good amount of discipline to overcome human inclinations, but without torturing the body the same way other monasteries did. It was orderly in the sense that it effectively provided stability for a group of people living together. The whole thing is actually quite long, maybe 80 pages, but I'd like us to look at some of it to get a sense of what was going on in these Benedictine monasteries. To begin with, the most conspicuous feature of Benedict's rule concerns what is called the divine office, which is basically a schedule of services that the monastery would follow. At this point, you can open up your Bentonson text to page 123 and read chapter 16 of the Rule of St. Benedict. And as you can see, it's a schedule that's based off of Psalm 119, verse 164, which says, 7 times a day I have praised you. In verse 62, at midnight I arose to give you praise. Therefore, Benedict is prescribing 8 services of prayer throughout the day. So go ahead, pause the presentation, and you can read chapter 16. The 8 prayer services each day looked something like this. At each service, the community was called to come together by a signal. Chapter 43 says, as soon as the signal for the time of the divine office is heard, let everyone, leaving whatever he hath in his hands, hasten with all speed, yet with gravity, that there may be no cause for levity. Therefore let nothing be preferred to the work of God. The point is that these hours give shape to the monastic day, and all other duties were fit around it. Furthermore, the divine office, or officium divinum, allowed the community to recite all 150 psalms every 7 days. Chapters 17 and 18, which are not reproduced in the Bentonson text, prescribed which psalms are sung at what hours and on which days. It's a little confusing to read, but the community is basically reciting 3 or 4 psalms at each time period, so that all the psalms are covered over a 7-day period. In between the services, the monks had specific periods of manual labor, reading, and prayer and devotion. At this point, you can open your Bentonson text again to pages 129 and 130 and read chapter 48. This will give you a good sense of what things looked like. Okay, so under Benedict, you aren't just performing the divine office. You are working and reading. If you look on page 130, about 8 lines down or so, notice how Benedict wants all things to be carried out in general. Let all things be done with moderation. Remember, I said the rule is noted for being comprehensive, orderly, and moderate. He's not wanting to be extreme in the way that some of the other ascetics had been. Now look at chapters 39 and 40 on pages 128 and 129. This will give you a good sense of the moderation that Benedict is talking about. You'll notice that he's advocating that the monks have 2 cooked meals a day. In other words, it's not extreme asceticism. And the same thing applies to drink when you read chapter 40. So go ahead and pause the presentation and read through chapters 39 and 40. In terms of the government of the monastery, the abbot or head of the monastery had complete authority. However, the abbot himself was chosen by the monks. If you want, you can look on page 133, chapter 64, which says, in appointing an abbot, this principle shall always be observed, that such a one shall be put into office as the whole congregation, according to the fear of God, with one heart. If the monastery was big, then the rule prescribed delegating the responsibilities. So the abbot would have a chief assistant, a prior or provost. However, make no mistake, the prior was not in any sense supposed to be considered on equal ground with the abbot. If you happen to look at Bentonson on page 134, chapter 65, the editor only gives us 2 words from this chapter, specifically that the prior or the provost is not a, quote, second abbot. A fuller portion of this chapter says, quote, it often happens indeed that grave scandals arise in monasteries out of the appointment of the prior, since there are some who, puffed up with the wicked spirit of pride and thinking themselves to be second abbots, set up a despotic rule, foster scandals, and excite quarrels in the community. end quote. To avoid this, he prescribes that the abbot appoint deans, leaders who are in charge of groups of 10. He says, "We foresee, therefore, that for the preservation of peace and charity, it is best that the government of the monastery should depend on the will of the abbot. And if it can be done, let the affairs of the monastery be attended to by deans, as the abbot shall dispose, so that, the same office being shared by many, no one may become proud." So while there's a hierarchy in place, the rubber hits the road with the abbot. At this point, you can pause the video and read through these chapters in the Bentenson text, and then we will continue along. What happens if someone gets out of line? What happens if someone isn't following the rule? Well, look on page 124 in the Bentenson text, chapter 23. "If a brother be found contumacious or disobedient, proud or a grumbler, or in any way acting contrary to the holy rule and despising the orders of his seniors, let him, according to the Lord's commandment, be privately admonished 1 and twice by his seniors. If he do not them amend, let him be publicly rebuked before all. But if even then he do not correct himself, let him be subjected to excommunication, if he understands the gravity of this penalty. If, however, he is incorrigible, let him undergo corporal chastisement." If you notice those words, according to the Lord's commandment, what he's trying to get at here is the passage in Matthew 18, "If a brother or sister sins, go and point out the fault between the two of you." That's what he's trying to base his rule of discipline on. Now flip over to page 126 in the Bentenson text. There's a comment about the younger members of the community. He writes, "Every age or intelligence ought to have its proper bounds. Therefore, as often as boys or youths, or those who are less able to understand how great is the punishment of excommunication, as often as such persons offend, they shall either be punished with extra fasts or coerced with severe blows, that they may be healed." So one of the points here is not just that the rule allows for corporal punishment, but that the rule is designed to work for a community made up of a variety of ages. It's sometimes overlooked that Benedict had a twin sister, Scholastica. Scholastica started her own convent just 5 miles away. This community functioned loosely under the rule as well, which makes Scholastica the first Benedictine nun. Until their deaths, the two periodically met and maintained a spiritual friendship. Anyway, when Benedict died in 547, his rule was basically a local phenomenon. However, it quickly became the dominant model for monasteries throughout Europe, so that by the end of the 8th century, it was being practiced all over the West. The question is sometimes asked, why did this become so popular? Why did so many people copy or replicate Benedict's model prescribed in the rule? Well, first, as I've been belaboring, the rule was moderate, comprehensive, and orderly. For those who read the whole thing, this is really the impression that you're left with. As one of my former medieval professors said, Benedict gave you a rigorous but manageable form of the ascetic life. Others note that Benedict was really offering stability in a world that was rather unstable. By the time we get to the 5th and 6th century, the western half of the empire is gone and invaders are constantly coming through. But with the monastery, which you enter for life, you are given a community that is predictable and steady, and in some cases, maybe even a higher standard of living. When historians talk about the transition to the Middle Ages and the emergence of a Roman Catholic tradition, they often highlight someone named Gregory, usually called Gregory the Great. Gregory was the bishop or pope of Rome for a mere 14 years. But he did a lot in those 14 years, which is part of the reason he gets to be the Great. In fact, in the West, he's considered one of the 4 doctors or teachers of the church, along with Ambrose, Jerome, and Augustine. So let's have a little bit about Gregory's life and influence and what he has to do with monasticism in the Middle Ages. Gregory was born in 540 to a wealthy, noble family in Rome. He was well educated and prepared for life of public service. And in fact, that is what happened to Gregory. In 570, he was appointed as prefect or chief magistrate of Rome. But after his father died, he quit the post, took the family inheritance, and started to establish monasteries with the money. He converted his own father's house and became a monk. However, he didn't get much relief from public life because in 578, the Bishop of Rome, Pelagius II, made him a presbyter and selected him to be his representative in Constantinople. He came back to the monastery in 585, but was elected Pope or Bishop of Rome after Pelagius died in 590. And actually, believe it or not, this makes Gregory the first monk to become Pope. So with Gregory, you have a Pope coming from a monastic perspective. As a result, he appoints a lot of other monks to be bishops and leaders. So in that sense alone, Gregory is really, really important because he's the first monastic Pope. That's the first point about Gregory. Second, Gregory is also important because he starts to emphasize and promote penitential activities. Penitential activities are ways in which Christians seek forgiveness. It's not that he disagreed that grace is primary or that human effort alone somehow brought about salvation. Gregory was adamant that Adam's fall affected all of his descendants. But unlike Augustine, he felt that once God moves a person by grace, then there are ways that humans cooperate with divine grace, particularly concerning post-conversion sins. For example, an increasingly common question that came up in the church was what happens when Christians sin. People started teaching that you could seek forgiveness for any particular sin once. And the effect was that Christians started to seek delaying forgiveness until later in life and persisting in their favorite sins. Gregory was really bothered by this and thought this was totally contrary to what the Christian life was supposed to be all about, namely seeking after God. So Gregory starts advocating that people should regularly confess sinful deeds and actions to some representative of the church. So that's another reason Gregory the Great is so important. He starts to promote penitential acts that will later become a really big component of the church. Third, Gregory is important because he promotes the doctrine of purgatory. People wanted to know what happened if someone died and they had not confessed their sins. Gregory suggested that there was a place after death in which one's sins would be purged before entering heaven. So where did he get this idea? Well, first, Augustine had speculated or suggested that there might be such a place. In addition, Gregory thought that it was taught, or at least implied, in Scripture. He pointed to passages like Matthew 12:32. The passage says that whoever speaks a word against the Son of Man will be forgiven, but whoever speaks against the Holy Spirit will not be forgiven either in this age or in the age to come. Gregory inferred that there must be a place for sins to be forgiven in another age, an age to come. Gregory had other passages too, like 1 Corinthians 3. For no one can lay any foundation other than the one that has been laid. That foundation is Jesus Christ. Now if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, the work of each builder will become visible, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed with fire, and the fire will test what sort of work each has done. If what has been built on the foundation survives, the builder will receive a reward. If the work is burned up, the builder will suffer loss. The builder will be saved, but only as through fire. Well, I don't know what you think about that exegesis, but for Gregory, he interpreted that to mean that people's deeds would be refined by fire. More specifically, he thought things like wood, hay, and straw were lesser sins that could be burned up in another age. At this point, you can pause the presentation, download the Gregory the Great handout, and read through the section on the doctrine of purgatory. Then we'll have a few comments. The point is that what others had speculated about, Gregory proclaimed dogmatically. And I don't know what you think about this whole idea of purgatory, but it made sense to a lot of people in the 7th century and following. You could say that Gregory was starting to put in place the system that would later drive Luther to despair some 900 years later. But that's later. Fourth, Gregory had an accelerated missionary campaign. Remember, you have all of these barbarian invaders coming down and taking control of the old Roman Empire, and Gregory tried to reach them. In fact, he was really good at it. And one of the reasons that he was so effective in bringing outsiders into the church was that he was quite open to accommodating local customs and cultures into Christianity. This handout provides a good example of Gregory's more liberal view of accommodating Christianity. It's taken from a letter to one of his missionaries in England in 601, and it concerns what to do with pagan temples. So go ahead and pause the presentation, download the document, and read through Gregory. This document will also give you a good example of Gregory's policies. So at this point, you can pause the presentation, turn to page 161, and read Gregory's advice to Augustine on liturgical provision. Then we'll have a couple of comments. The main thing that you want to remember from this text is that Gregory is really interested in what works, rather than trying to make everything perfectly uniform. Fifth, and finally, Gregory wrote a very important book called The Pastoral Rule. It's a series of brief readings or essays on the importance of humility. He spends a lot of time emphasizing the importance of church leaders nourishing or taking care of their own souls. In fact, I might add at this point that of all the things that I read in my doctoral studies, this might have been one of the more edifying texts. If you've been able to keep up with the Gonzalez reading, then you might be feeling like the story of Christianity starts to get almost too confusing to keep up with. The Roman Empire is gone, and you have all of these different invaders coming through Europe. So politically, it's a really complicated kind of story, and it's difficult to stay on top of all these different tribes. And furthermore, the eastern side of the empire, or the Byzantine Empire, is still in place. And although theoretically it's all still one church, the interaction is decreasing and the quarreling is increasing. So for a lot of people, it's at this point in church history that you begin to lose the forest for the trees. To help with all of that, I'd like to have you watch part of a documentary by a professor at Oxford named McCulloch. Obviously, documentaries aren't perfectly unbiased. I have a friend who teaches at Greenville College in Illinois, and he says that he finds McCulloch to be cheeky. Nevertheless, he gives us a good, concise overview of the Middle Ages. So go ahead and watch the documentary, The Unpredictable Rise of Rome, and I will see you in the next lecture.